Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. You're joining us all the way across the continent, and welcome to another exciting Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants broadcast with us. My name is Jesse, and I've got to say, before my formal intro, Miss McDonald and Miss Barra's class, you guys are so energized today joining us live on StreamYard. Such a pleasure to get to do this job. We got a whole bevy of other classes on YouTube. Please let us know where you're joining from. And it's so nice to wrap up the school week in style. Now, it is May. Spring is here. It's a really exciting time. You can catch all our 60 programs plus on our YouTube channel if you're keen on that. But I'm so excited today because you guys get to hang out with me and our friends at the Toronto Zoo. Many of you will know, but once a month we do a special program in conjunction with the amazing zoo team showcasing their animals, their conservation, their stories, and more. It's always the most fun part of my month. But this month in May, we get to do 2 programs with them. We're doing one later on No Small Feat. Should be quite a bit of fun. But today we are starting off with Adopt a Pond. We're going to learn a little bit about the amazing work that they do with frogs and amphibians. We're going to learn more about these incredible creatures. And honestly, it's just going to be such a good time. It's our first of 3 frog programs this month too. So we're really kicking it off in style to wrap up the week. Without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Mary Ellen, educator extraordinaire, and the rest of the zoo team. Mary Ellen, thank you so much for joining today. Welcome again.
Hello. Thank you so much, Jesse. I have to say your introductions get better and better every time we have a video. I love it so much. It energizes us, gets us ready to do our broadcast. And we are so excited to be joining you here today and everyone watching to learn about our amazing conservation team here at the Toronto Zoo, our Adopt a Pond team, and learn about the Spring Toad Festival that we're actually hosting a little bit today and then on site here tomorrow. So if you happen to live near the Toronto Zoo and wanted to come on site tomorrow from 10 till 2 p.m., we are running a Spring Toad Festival to learn all about these incredible creatures, our frogs and toads and amphibians around us. Now, before I turn the camera over and we get our program started, I'm going to have Jesse bring up our land acknowledgement here for us. So we would like to acknowledge that the land that we stand on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Thank you so much, Jesse. So I'm actually going to turn the camera around and be a little bit more behind the scenes today. And we are going to meet with and learn from one of our experts here at the Toronto Zoo. My favorite colleague here, we have Rachel with us.
Hi, everyone. How's it going today? I'll just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Rachel. I work with the Adopt a Pond program here at the Toronto Zoo. Our focus is reptile and amphibian conservation and protecting the species that live in our own backyards. I think a lot of people think when you work at the Toronto Zoo that you must be a zookeeper or a veterinarian. And there's also lots of other jobs that happen here, like Mary Ellen in our education department, but also with us on our conservation science team, not only looking after the animals' conservation at a global scale, but also at a local scale and protecting those animals that live in our own backyards. So to do that, we do things like this. We do outreach, we do research, and we like to share our knowledge with the community around us. And one of our favorite things that we like to talk about here at the Adopt a Pond program are things that live in ponds. And one of the first things that we worked for conservation or worked to conserve as Adopt a Pond are frogs and toads. And so this time of year, it's a little bit more of a dreary day here today, but when spring arrives, it's my favorite time of year, because that's when the frogs and toads come back out after spending a long winter of overwintering. So we're here at the Canadian Wetlands habitat here at your Toronto Zoo, and we're going to talk a little bit about frogs and introduce our Spring Toad Festival, which is happening here tomorrow at the Toronto Zoo from 10 to 3 as we celebrate those toads that are coming out of their hibernation and their overwintering. So I'd like to start this off by asking everybody here, what do you think is a frog? What are the key things that make a frog and make it different than a different type of animal or a different species that you might be thinking of?
Yeah. Well, Rachel, we've got a whole bunch of YouTube classes. We've got our live classes with us. So I might go to our classes and see if they want to chime in and see what their thoughts are on frogs. Miss Barajas, we'll begin with you guys. What makes a frog? What jumps out? Hi. Do you guys have any thoughts? What makes a frog?
What did you say, Ellen? Jumping. Croaking.
It croaks. I heard that.
Jumping, croaking, very good. Miss McDonald, class, unmute your mic. Do you guys have any thoughts too? What do we think?
What makes a frog, guys?
Green skin.
Green skin?
Eggs.
Eggs, green skin,
Okay.
croaking,
Eggs.
riveting,
Got it.
hopping. Great picks, guys.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll leave it
perfect.
there. Tell it more.
Awesome. So that's great. So there are a few, you guys hit a couple of those hit those nails right on the head. There are a couple things that make a frog and make it special. One of those things is that it's a type of animal that's called an amphibian. And what makes it, there's a couple things that make a frog an amphibian. And I heard it from somebody, I heard something about skin. So one of those things is that it has soft, moist skin. And that's because frogs and toads can actually get oxygen and things out of the water through their skin because they spend so much time in the water that they need kind of a little bit of extra supplement there. So they can actually get moisture and oxygen through their skin. So that's a really important thing. I don't know if I heard this one, but something else that makes a frog and toad an amphibian is that they're cold-blooded or ectothermic, which is a really big fancy word to say that their body temperature is regulated by the environment around them. So for mammals, so people and like other animals like dogs, they have to do other things to regulate their body temperature. So dogs pant to help cool themselves down. As people, if we're cold without even thinking about it, our bodies, they start to shiver and our muscles start to contract and move in order to warm our bodies up. But if we're too hot, without even us having to tell our bodies to do it, we start to sweat to help cool ourselves down. And for cold-blooded animals like amphibians, their bodies can't do that. So they need to move within the environment that they live in or within the habitat, the place that they live, to warm up or cool down. So that's often why you might see frogs. Sometimes you see them down in the water. Sometimes you might see them up on a log. And that's because they're moving to different places to either raise or lower their body temperatures so their bodies can work the way they need to. They need to be warm in order to break down their food that they like to eat, but they also need to be cool because if they get too warm, they can get sick. So a really important thing is that they are cold-blooded. Something else is because they have to, regulate their body temperatures in that way, they're often what we call semi-aquatic. And so they live on land and in water. And that's because both land and water provide them with that important habitat they need in order to regulate that body temperature. They also have certain parts of their life cycles and things that happen more on land than in water and vice versa. So frogs, I heard somebody say that they lay eggs. And so that's really a really awesome point. And most amphibians, and especially frogs, they lay their eggs in the water. So the water has a really important part of their life cycle. And then as their eggs hatch and they become tadpoles, and then as they grow into becoming adults, they spend all of their time in water. And then once they become an adult, they might come up out of the water to move from place to place, to find new places to live, and to find things like food. So both land and water are super important for frogs and toads. And then one last thing is that almost all frogs and toads are carnivores. So I have a little hint here, but that means they eat meat. So a carnivore versus an omnivore, which is an animal who might eat both plants and meat, or a herbivore, which is an animal that eats just plants. So most frogs are carnivores and they eat lots of things, especially insects and bugs. They really love mosquitoes. They love the insects and bugs that live or have part of their life cycles in the water. And so they're actually super, super important for making sure that there is a good balance of insects and other animals like that in our environment. So they help kind of regulate populations, which is really, really cool. So all of those things together, there's a lot more things that make frogs special, but all of these things are what makes a frog a frog. So you guys hit some of those points. Awesome, you guys got some of those right away, which is super exciting. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're having the Spring Toad Festival, and I was talking about frogs and toads. And a lot of people think that frogs and toads are the same thing, but they're actually a little bit different. They're both amphibians, and they're both semi-aquatic, but there are a few things that make them a little different. I'll ask another question here, if that's okay, Jesse. Does anybody know what might be special about toads that might be different from frogs?
Well, let's see. Miss Berber's class, Miss Corr's class, you guys are on YouTube. Feel free to chime in. We'll come back to our live class as well. Miss Fisher's class, difference between toads and frogs. If you have any thoughts on that, what do we think? Hey, guys.
Hey, why are we waiting for Tom Hanks to make Toy Story 5?
What do you think? What's the difference, Brady? You got one?
Why are we waiting for Tom Hanks?
You gotta shout it out. Waylon, give us one. What's the difference? Oh, no, but give us the difference.
I know that
Give it.
toad skin is bumpy.
Toads are bumpy.
Toad skin
Toads are
is
bumpy.
bumpy.
That's a good
That's
one.
really,
Yep.
really good. And that actually came through on YouTube as well. So our options so far are bumpy skin. That's what we'll stick with. Can you tell us a little more?
I think that's a perfect answer. And so often the difference between frogs and toads is that toads often have bumpy skin. They have what we call warts. There's this myth that a lot of people think that if you touch a toad that you can get a wart, and that is not true. The warts are kind of just the bumpiness of their skin. They're not something that, are weirdly attached to them. It's all part of their body. Something different is that toads spend a lot more time on land than most frogs. So they're a lot more what we say terrestrial. They like to spend more time on land. And something else is that they do need water to survive. They lay their eggs in water. But they often spend, more time on land, and they often have a little bit more drier skin. So they're okay with being out of water for longer. And that's why they tend to live on land a little bit more. But the one that they have warts, or bumpy skin is a perfect answer. And it's one of those things, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. And it's very similar about frogs and toads. So toads are a type of frogs, but a very special type of frogs, and not all frogs are toads. So that's what makes them a little bit special. And the reason that we love toads so much here at Adopt-A-Pond and at the Toronto Zoo is that we are super fortunate to have a habitat here on site that the toads like to live in. And we actually were very lucky earlier. They're probably not going to call again, but we actually heard a toad starting to call. And they really like to live, especially, or spend their springs in these kind of wetland habitats. So places that have lots of vegetation, they have lots of water, there's lots of places for them to hide, there's lots of things for them to eat. We mentioned that they're carnivores, they like to eat insects. Some frogs and toads even like to eat smaller fish, sometimes even smaller frogs and toads and smaller animals. So there's everything they need are right here. And when it's time, when spring comes, we always can tell that it's spring because the frogs and toads start to call. And that's really important because they start to call in order to say, hey, I'm looking for love. So they're looking for a mate. They're looking for somebody to mate with in order to lay eggs and further build the number of frogs or toads that are out in the wild. And so that's what the toads are doing right here, right now at the Toronto Zoo, and why we have our festival, because we can actually see that happening right in front of us, which is really cool. They all get into this kind of trance when they're ready to mate and ready to start laying eggs and having babies. And sometimes you can get pretty up close and watch them from a safe distance away without them being too bothered. So it's really cool that we can kind of see that happening right here. So we kind of talked about that. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of frogs and toads, just very briefly. So frogs and toads are really cool. Again, like they said, they lay their eggs in water most of the time. And they go through a process that's called metamorphosis. I'll ask one more question, Jesse, if that's okay. Does anybody have an idea of some other animal, before I explain what metamorphosis is, any other animal that might go through the process of metamorphosis? That might be a good example.
Ooh, what
Any ideas?
While we're waiting for that question, I just want to note, it's so amazing you have so many calls around you. Like, it's so springy in Toronto. It's marvelous for all our kids.
Yes.
4 or 5, Miss McDonald's class, if you guys want to chime in, what undergoes metamorphosis? What do we think? Butterflies, our first one. Spot on, guys.
That's the answer I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So it's something that when a animal is born, what it looks like when it's little is completely different than what it looks like when it becomes and grows up to be an adult. And so frogs and toads go through that process. You guys have probably heard or maybe even seen things like tadpoles. And so those are just young frogs. And they need to live most of their time in the water. So I have a cool little life cycle here that hopefully you guys can see. And so every spring, frogs and toads come out from spending their winters in wetlands or on the land around the wetlands, and they come and they mate and find boyfriends and girlfriends, and then they start to lay eggs. And over the next few weeks or few months, those eggs will start to grow, and little tiny tadpoles will start to develop inside those eggs. Eventually, those eggs will hatch, maybe sometime in the early summer, especially here in Ontario, but it might be different in other parts of the world. And they'll become a little tadpole, which is just kind of like a little bean with a tail. And then even through the summer, and for some frogs and even toads, sometimes they stay as tadpoles over the winter. And then the next spring, they start to go through their process of metamorphosis. So they start to grow their legs. Their tail starts to shrink, their body starts to grow, they start to develop all those important organs. And then eventually, sometimes it's only a few months, sometimes it's over a year, they become an adult. And then they start that cycle all over again, which is really, really cool. So it's exciting that we get to see that happening right here at the Toronto Zoo. And I think something else that I want to mention is the importance of frogs. And so why are we so excited? Why do we want to tell people about frogs and toads? And why do we care that they're here? I mentioned earlier that they're carnivores, so they're really important for keeping insect and populations in check. They're an important part of the food web. And so you guys have probably talked about food webs and food chains before, but we like to call them webs because there's not always in a very a straight line. There's not always a clear levels of who kind of belongs on that chain. Sometimes they belong in multiple parts of that food chain. And so we kind of makes up a big web. So we like to call it a food web. And depending on the frog and the part of its life that it's in is kind of what role it plays in that food web. So the eggs are super important food for lots of different animals like fish, sometimes other frogs, other reptiles and other amphibians that might live in wetland habitats, so like turtles and even snakes and things like that, birds. And then as they start to get older and bigger, the tadpoles become food for kind of bigger animals, so bigger turtles, bigger frogs, bigger birds. And then as they become adults, they start to become both predators, so both things that like to eat other things, but also prey, so the food for those other animals like birds and turtles and other things like that. So they play a very important role that way, play a very important role in population control. And so that means that if all of a sudden frogs and toads in an area disappeared, we would really notice. All of a sudden, we would have so many more mosquitoes than we already have, which I'm sure most of you guys are not big fans of mosquitoes because it is not fun when you get bitten by a mosquito. And so having something naturally out there in the environment to help regulate and keep those populations, the number of mosquitoes out in the wild in check, is super important. And you would start to see changes in waterways and wetlands and things like that as well. You'd start to see either less of other species because the food sources like that the frogs provide for them might have disappeared. And you might see introductions of new other species that might be filling those spots of those frogs and toads. So it's really important to protect them because unfortunately they are one of the most endangered species or at-risk species that we have in the whole world, or animal group in the whole world. So there's over 7,000 different types of frogs and toads globally across the world. And they have the biggest proportion of that number that are what we call a species at risk, which means that there's something that people are doing to them to cause a decline in the number of them out in the wild. So causing the number of them to go down. And that's actually the whole reason the Adopt a Pond program started here at the Toronto Zoo in the early 1990s, was because there was this global call for action to help protect frogs because they were disappearing and it didn't seem that a lot of people really cared. And so it's really important that we kind of share our knowledge, tell people how important and cool these animals are in order to protect them, to make sure that they can keep doing those services and those things that we need them to do in order to keep our natural environments happy and healthy. So I think that might be a good time to start opening up to some questions. I could talk forever about frogs and toads, but I think that I've kind of talked about a lot of things. So, and if we have some questions kind of come in, that might help guide the rest of our discussion.
Amazing. Well, Rachel, first and foremost, thank you so much for all of that, and great participation from all our classes too. Before we dive in with questions, do you want me to play that little clip of some of the frogs calling out? Because that's pretty fun.
Of course I do. So I was talking about how important spring is for frogs and toads, and I was saying that they're out here mating, and you might hear frogs and toads calling in the spring, and that's because they're saying, "Hey, I'm ready to find a girlfriend, and I'm ready to find a mate." And it's often the male frogs that are calling, the ones that are out there calling. And so when you go into a wetland in spring, it's almost like an amazing symphony of calls. You'll have the birds calling and things like that, but especially this time of year, the frogs will start to call as well. And each frog or each type of frog has a very different, distinct call that you can actually tell what kind of frog is in this wetland based on the calls that you are hearing. Just like each bird species has a unique call. And so what we actually do to help monitor frogs and help learn about their populations is we put, which I totally should have brought one, but we put a little recording device out into wetlands, and we listen, and we go through we records a bunch of things, and then after we take it back to our computers and we listen for those specific calls. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out who's calling when because all these different species are calling over top of each other. But it's just what excites me the most about spring. And so, yes, Jesse, I shared this really awesome little video for you, which I think is in an area based around kind of Michigan, so around the Great Lakes area of the United States, which are very similar to the species that we have here in Ontario. And it shows that how the calls you might hear change as the seasons go and as we go from spring into summer. And try and listen. And there's one kind of call that sounds like we call it a trill. It's almost like a, I don't really know the best way to describe it, but that's the toad calling, and it starts to call a little bit later into spring. And that's why they're starting to kind of call and breed right now. So yes, let's play that video. Thank you, Jesse.
Super cool. Thank you so much for that, guys. And yeah, we're going to dive in with questions now. So anything you want to know about frogs, we've already got a bunch of great questions in our YouTube chat, and then we are going to head to all our live classes. So our Miss McDonald crew, we are going to come to you guys first in a second live, but I'm going to take a quick one from YouTube just to give you all a chance to percolate with those questions. Let's see. Miss Quirk's class joining us in Stratford. They want to know, do frogs only lay eggs once a year?
Ooh, that is an excellent question. So here in Ontario, Canada, where we are right now, yes, typically frogs only lay eggs once a year. In terms of other parts of the world or even other parts of the United States, I'm not 100% sure, but there's a very good chance that they might lay eggs more than once. So we see that with a lot of different species, especially reptiles like turtles, where we start to see if they have a period or live in a place where they have a longer summer. We call it their active period. So the longer time where they're not hibernating or overwintering, spending the winter kind of hunkered down, that they may lay eggs multiple times. But typically in this part of the world, they only lay their eggs in spring because it takes a really long time for those eggs to develop, go through that process of metamorphosis and become an adult frog. So that typically, they only lay them in spring. But like I said, that might be different in different parts of the world.
Amazing. Well, we're going to head to our St. Catharines crew. There, Taj, grade 4-5. Do you want to unmute your mic? You are good to go. Hey.
Okay, go for it, Gloria.
When is the most common time for them to lay eggs?
Ooh, most common time for them to lay eggs, Rachel?
That is a great question. So again, it very much depends on where you are, but spring is that most common time. But where in spring that they the timing in spring that they lay their eggs varies even here in the province of Ontario based on where you are. So there's some eggs, like I've already seen frog eggs this year from green frogs that have been laying their eggs, which actually, if we can take a look, see if you guys have got a good eye, you may even be able to see a couple of these green frogs that I'm talking about here in the wetland. And so, they've already kind of started to lay their eggs, and other amphibians like salamanders maybe have already started to lay their eggs. So it all depends on the species, but like toads, they typically start later than other species. And even, so they're only starting to lay their eggs right now. It has to be nice and decently. Woo! Somebody just hopped off the edge. It's so
Hey.
oh, and then there's another little frog over there too. There's lots of frogs.
They're everywhere. They're behind me right now.
So yeah, spring in general is a good answer, but the month within spring that they lay eggs varies from where you are and the type of species that you have. So like bullfrogs may not even start to lay their eggs until the end of May into early June. So yeah, it all very much varies, but spring is that important time.
Lovely. Ms. Barras, we're going to head to Oxnard, California. If you guys want to come on in, you're good to go. Hey.
Do toads have a smooth skin than frogs?
So toads actually have bumpier skin than frogs, so it's a little bit more. They have what we call warts on them, so a little bit more lumpy and bumpy. But frogs do tend to have a smoother, kind of softer, moister skin than the toads do. But it's a pretty distinct trait of all toads, no matter kind of where you are in the world, that they do have bumpy skin. But there might be some species in parts of the world that have less bumpy skin than others. But yeah, that's kind of how you know that a toad is a toad, is because they've got that kind of lumpy, bumpy skin.
Perfect. Thanks, Guy. We're going to head to Carsonville. Ms. Fisher's class, I'm coming to you, and then I'm going to take a few from our YouTube classes. We are whipping through Q&A, so lots of time. We're going to come and do a whole round with everyone else, I promise. But yeah, let's head to Michigan to kick us off. Hey, guys. Hi.
What makes their tongues so sticky?
What makes their tongue so sticky? You know what? That is actually a really good question. So the really kind of like in-depth scientific answer, I don't really know, but I know that they have certain types of there's tongue, despite not being able to see it really well, it's really textured. So it's got like, I don't know if you guys have a cat at home, and when a cat licks you, that it's kind of bumpy, and that helps them kind of groom themselves, and kind of scratchy. I think the frog and toad's tongues are somewhat similar to that they've got really, really tiny little, they're not hairs, but little, I don't know, bits and pieces that they can then stick onto other things. They also have very special things and enzymes and different like bacteria and saliva and all that kind of stuff that helps all of that stick onto the bugs and the things that they eat. And they have excellent eyesight. So you've probably seen a video or seen a frog reach out with their tongue and grab a fly flying by, because they have an excellent sense of eyesight or excellent vision, that they can really react really quickly. And having that sticky tongue really helps them be able to catch the food that they need. So that's a really good question.
Is a really good question. Thanks, guys. We actually have another tongue one coming in on YouTube. Miss Sperber's class, our Wisconsin group, they want to know, why do they have long tongues? And this might just be a similar answer, that basically to catch their prey, but if there's anything to add, and do they have long tongues?
They definitely do have long tongues, and that's exactly it. It's because they're not always they're really good swimmers, but a lot of times the things that they want to eat aren't living in the water. They're living above the water. And so if they have a nice long tongue, they can stay where it's nice and safe along the edge in the water and reach up to get the things that they want to eat, like those mosquitoes, maybe a dragonfly, something that fly by really quickly. And so they can, really reach out and grab that really well. So yeah, that's definitely why they have nice long tongues.
Nice. Let's take another one from our YouTube friends. Miss Allen's group wants to know, what's a frog's lifespan?
That is a very good question. And so it all depends on the frog and the species of frog. And for species to species, I'm actually not really sure what the lifespan might be. For most of our Canadian species, it's often, maybe 5 years. I think it can be, as high as 10. But that's not something I have kind of off the top of my head. But there are some other toads, especially things like toads, that can live for a really long time and upwards of like 20 years in different parts of the world.
This is one of those tricky questions that we get in every broadcast. So a quick look up of this. 20 to 30 years seems to be the absolute limit for frogs in certain conditions. And it's not all frogs. Some are much, much shorter than that, days or even weeks. So very cool question. It really depends on the species. Frogs are a really big group, and that's going to be the answer for a lot of these questions over biggest, strongest, fastest, when they lay eggs. Frogs are really, really diverse. So keep that in mind for the rest of our Q&A. But I love the thought behind that question, guys. All right, we're going to get back to Miss McDonald's crew. Come on back in, St. Catharines, and take us away.
Okay. Go for it.
most popular species of frog to see when you're in the forest or in your front yards.
Yeah. So this at school. It's right near you guys, Rachel. So what's the most common frog that they find near you?
So there are a couple. So the frogs that we are looking at right now are green frogs. So I think green frogs are probably a species that you would see a lot. They're what we like to call kind of generalist species. So they're a lot less picky about where they like to live than maybe some other species. So you can see that we're kind of just in a shallow pond. You might see green frogs even in a bigger lake, or even maybe in a river or a stream habitat. So they're a lot less picky about where they like to live. So you see a lot of those. Here in at the Toronto Zoo specifically, a species that we see and hear a lot of, which I might be hearing a toad right now, so maybe we can pop back over and see if we can hear it again, is actually tree frogs. There's gray tree frogs that we have here, and we hear them a lot. You don't see them as often because they're very good. They have very good camouflage, and they can actually change their color to blend in to the environment around them. But that's a pretty common one. One you would see in the spring. In the summer that you might hear as well at your cottages, things like that, are bullfrogs. So there's lots of bullfrogs around too. And they're the biggest species we have here in Ontario. I don't know if you guys can hear it on there, but the toads are calling right now. And it's a very long kind of trill, like almost like a buzz. I don't know if the phone will be picking it up. But
yeah, very, very faintly in the background, but not quite enough. But that's very cool that that's happening mid-broadcast.
Yes. Yeah, very cool. So yeah, I would say green frogs, toads, and bullfrogs, and also leopard frogs are another one that you might see that look a lot like a green frog, but they've got lots of spots all over them that kind of look like a leopard, so that's how they get their name. So those are probably the most common ones you'll see in this area and just in Ontario in general. They have the biggest ranges, so the widest spread of where they live in this area.
Nice. I moved to Newfoundland, so I have a lot fewer frogs than I used to back when I was in Ontario, but we do have the leopard frog, and it is delightful to hear them in our local little wetland. So very cool, guys. Miss Barajas, we're going to head to you guys in California. Come on in and take us away. Hey.
Hi, most of my kids went to recess, but there was a question. And the question was, is there a difference between how far frogs jump versus toads?
Ooh.
Yes, that's a really good question. And yes, there is. So frogs are much more known for jumping, especially as their main form of movement, right? That they'll jump from place to place or swim. Toads are actually, they do jump, but they jump a lot less. And in terms of comparison of actual distance, I'm not sure. I'm sure there is somebody's looked at that somewhere in the world. But they tend to crawl a little bit more, which is something when you see a toad crawling around, it's actually very, very funny. But yeah, they tend to walk a little bit more than jump, where frogs, it's their initial instinct is just to jump away. But I would say, just from my experience, my knowledge is that frogs definitely can jump farther than toads. But yeah, I don't know about the big, an actual number about difference. Well, I'm sure it's up there somewhere.
Really, really big frogs and toads are this large, so they can jump many, many feet when they're going in one go. I encourage you, king toads, that are fairly famous in Australia, are gigantic. I can try and find a West African Goliath frog. I'll try and pull up a picture as we go through the rest of Q&A together to give you a sense of how large the largest frogs are. But powerful legs like that could propel you quite the distance, and that's a great question, guys.
Definitely. They have really strong back legs for swimming and for jumping. And so, yeah, they use them for crawling around. So they use them for all of those things in order to get where they need to go.
Nice. We are going to take just a few more questions together. Time flies and you're having fun in these broadcasts. Miss Fisher, I will wrap up with you live in just a minute. But two other quick ones before we go. On YouTube, Miss Ferber's class are what animals eat frog eggs?
Ooh, very good question. A big one is fish. That's a really big one because frog eggs, they typically lay their eggs in a big goo. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen, I'm sure you guys have played with things like Orbeez that are kind of squishy. And so a frog egg kind of looks like an Orby, but in this the Orbeez and slime, the funnest things to play with. And so they're, especially when they're nice in the water, they're really easy for things like fish to eat. So actually a lot of frogs and toads and other amphibians, so things like salamanders, they actually choose to lay their eggs in places that we like to call vernal pools. And so they look kind of just like a puddle in the forest. and they often are only wet in the spring after the snow melt and all of the rain, but there's no fish there. And so they often choose to lay their eggs there because it has a better chance of them being able to survive. Actually, in this pond right now, I saw that there's some little bluegill sunfish and things like that. So it may be unlikely that the frogs actually choose to lay their eggs right here, because there's lots of, there's things that might want to eat those eggs. But I think fish are probably the number one thing that like to eat frog eggs.
If you lay eggs in the natural world, pretty much everything wants to eat them, is one of the morals of all our conservation stories. I just brought up a picture of a West African Goliath frog, too, just so you can get a sense of scale. Like, these are gigantic frogs, so they can jump a very long distance.
We get some big toads and bullfrogs here in Ontario, but nothing gets that big.
Nothing gets that big. Nothing even close. Adopt a bigger pond in West Africa.
Yes.
We're going to take one more from YouTube, and then Miss Fisher, we're coming to you to wrap up in just a second. Guys, I'm going to email all our classes with more info on Adopt a Pond when we're done as well, so stay tuned for that. We'd also love to hear what you all thought, of course. But Miss Cork's group in Stratford, they want to know, does a toad's bumpy skin have a specific purpose that we know of?
That is a very good question. I don't like, it definitely has a purpose, and most of it I think is for camouflage, to be able to blend into the places that they like to live. And I mean, as most things, that's the colors that they are. So they, especially because they like to live on land and in forests a little bit more, they really blend into the leaves. And there's actually two different types of toads that live here in Ontario. There's the American toad, which is the one that we are hearing here today. And then there's also the Fowler's toad, which lives, if anybody's living near Lake Erie, you might have a Fowler's toad in that area. And they like to live on the sand dunes and on the beaches. And so that really helps them kind of blend in there. I'm also assuming because they like to live on land, it also helps increase what we say like surface area to help them get more like oxygen and all that kind of stuff as well. And then, it also has, there are some that have glands on the back of their necks that have like a kind of toxin that help protect them from being eaten by other things. And so there's typically kind of glands on the back of their neck that hold that. But for many species, those may also be in their warts and things like that too.
Fascinating. Yeah, the parotoid gland is what it's called. Like the big wart is what it looks like on a toad, sort of behind the eye. You can't miss it on most toads that you're ever going to find. And I'm really glad we got that question. Thanks, guys.
That's really good.
We're going to wrap up with one more. I want us to know a special, again, a big thank you to the Toronto Zoo team. Check out their website. Go if you can in person. There's so many extraordinary things to discover. If you're not anywhere near Toronto, like our California crew, head to a local zoo near you. There's some really incredible things that you can learn. Amazing educators like Rachel. And specifically, if you are in the Toronto area, the Adopt a Pond program is super, super cool. Let's wrap up in Carsonville. Come on in, guys, and take us away.
All right, Sean has a question.
Hi, Sean.
What kind of frog is the most rarest, and what kind of frog is endangered?
Ooh, great question.
Excellent question. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because I realized earlier that I mentioned that these frogs are kind of disappearing across the world, but I didn't really talk too much about why. So I think that's an excellent question. So here in Ontario, I would say the frog that is the rarest is that Fowler's toad that we talked about. So it's one of the few toads that are actually what we call like an official species at risk. So it's something that's been put on a list to say that, hey, something is happening to this species. They are disappearing because of things that humans are doing, and we need to do something in order to help fix that. And so we need to, where they live, we need to protect that area because this species lives there. And so they have an endangered species status here in Ontario. But unfortunately, and then also, so there's also a species that has disappeared from Ontario, which might be in other parts of the world, which is called the cricket frog, which is a teeny, tiny little frog that might still be here, but nobody has heard one in quite a while. And so we think that they've completely disappeared, which not from the world as a whole, but from Ontario. So that it's a big word that we say it's become extirpated. So it's become locally extinct from an area, and extinct meaning it's disappeared.
Yeah.
So here in Ontario, those are kind of our most endangered or rarest species. And the reason that they have started to disappear, the biggest thing is habitat loss. They've lost the wetlands that they need to live in to survive. in Ontario, specifically in southern Ontario, where we are right now, we've lost 90% of the wetlands that were here before we started building cities and houses and moved in here to really develop this area. And so, because often for a long time, wetlands were not really seen as important to people. Land that was important was areas where they could build houses and build factories and all those kind of things. So those wetlands often got filled in or changed in some way. And so it was no longer what we say suitable habitat or a good place for these animals to live. Another thing that really impacts or makes them become endangered or start to disappear is pollution. And so you can actually see in this wetland, if you look, there's lots of like green stuff hanging on top of the water. So a lot of that is a little plant called duckweed, which is super important, but some of that is algae. And that algae forms because there's too many like nutrients. So we need vitamins and things for us to eat in order to stay happy and healthy and our bodies to work right. And plants need nutrients like fertilizers and things like that, nutrients in the soil in order to grow. But often we add those nutrients to a landscape or to a place, especially on a farm, in order to make our food grow better, or on our lawns to make our lawns greener. And often everything we do in an area is all connected. So if it rains, all of those nutrients and those things have moved from your lawn, your nice, pretty green back lawn, and into your closest waterway. And so it can cause this algae to start to form because the algae uses all those nutrients and because there's too much of it, it needs something to do. But it actually starts to then take up the oxygen that's in the water and makes it a really less nice place for something to live. And because frogs have soft, moist skin, changes to the water, whether that's through chemicals or through nutrients and changing of oxygen, really can impact them in a big way. And so that's another thing that's caused them to, their numbers of them out in the wild to change. And then also things like climate change. So this year, especially here in Ontario, we had a very weird spring where it was really kind of cool and damp, wet, and then it got really, really hot for a while, and all the frogs and toads came out way earlier than we expected. And then all of a sudden it got cold really quick. And we don't think it had too much of a big impact on them yet, but it does impact, those life cycles, when they start laying their eggs, how many eggs they lay, and how much water is there. Actually this spring, because we didn't get a lot of snow last winter, we actually didn't have as much water as we normally do in places that we normally do. So all of those things can affect frogs and how they survive, and can all add to that, why they might be at risk or why they might be disappearing. In terms of like the most rare frog in the world, that I do not know off the top of my head, but I'm sure if you do a quick Google search, it'll be able to tell you that. And I can probably guarantee that the reason that it's starting to disappear, or the rarest frog, is probably the same kind of things that we just talked about.
Well, thank you very much for the detailed answer, Rachel, and thank you to the whole zoo team for the amazing Adopt a Pond program. Classes, we really appreciate your time today and absolutely all of this. So for you, Mary Ellen with the camera, all of you folks will turn the camera back on you and say a big farewell and thank you very much. Classes, stay tuned for a nice email in just a minute with a few additional things to keep the learning going. And if you're keen to join us near the end of the month, we're having the leader of the Amphibian Survival Alliance, like the leading amphibian conservationist in the world, coming on to talk about her work to conserve frogs, just like what we were talking about. So it should be a very special broadcast if you're keen, Gina Della Togna. But for now, I'll bring in our L'Heritage School, Ms. Barras, Ms. Fisher. Thank you so much for sticking around, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye for now.